Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good to be with you again on a Sunday morning. Thank you for joining in on Facebook and YouTube. Welcome to the space. On a Sunday morning, as you probably know, we take an hour to set ourselves into a different way of thinking and being that is open to this cultivation of peace and deep insight so that we can wake up and know that in this awakening we rediscover this deeper self that's hidden by a world of distraction and by a self that really is not who we truly are, but what we've been accustomed to thinking we are. And so this is a very deep teaching that is also very practical. And the way that we're going to approach it this morning is kind of a reconnection to last week. That as we go on this path of awakening, there are very important principles and steps to learn as we go. And one of them is there is very much like you see within the seasonal changes of the environment. There's a time where you cast off, much like in autumn, where things begin to fade and turn brown and drop away. And then you go into sort of a winter pattern where things go dormant and you go inward. And that's, of course, followed by the rebirth or the spring and then the full flowering of summer. And so we're not exempt from this cyclical nature. And so we also, whether it's in a natural biological rhythm or in a more subtle spiritual rhythm, we go through these patterns of shedding and rebirth. And so we talked last week about shedding and how important it is to give up some of these ideas as we looked in the pages of Mark Nepo's book on awakening, that we have sometimes these dead ideas. And he says dead eyes can't see, dead ears can't hear, dead fingers can't touch. In other words, sometimes we hang on to these old ways of thinking and being that are really so about the past and not about the present, that we can't actually experience the joy of the rebirth within the present moment because we're clinging, because we think we need to carry with us these old patterns and old belief systems. And so I wanted to share sort of a continuation in Mark Nepo's book of Awakening on what keeps us from shedding. So again, this is all about a rhythmical journey, a journey where you find that you're going to go through these archetypal patterns of death and rebirth. And it's very good to point out where in our lives we can, make these adjustments, open our awareness to seeing what's working and what's not working in our current life situation, and then make those informed choices to open up the energy flow and to bring in the joy and the spring of rebirth. So in his entry on what keeps us from shedding, we read, "Often we give up our right to renewal to accommodate the anxiety of those around us." Right, so sit with that for a moment. So sometimes we feel the rhythm, we feel the push or the pull to let go of a certain way of being or a certain way of relating. But because of the people in our life, we feel like we would let them down if we were different, or we would cause them more stress and anxiety if we made these major changes for ourselves, even though we're feeling that is the right and the healthy choice. And oftentimes we, sort of settle on being stuck in these old patterns because we don't want to upset the dynamic of our current relationship status. So there's a really interesting follow-up to this statement here. He says, "For sure, living is not easy, and living openly is both wondrous and dangerous. The fact is that shedding, no matter how useful or inevitable, always has a pain of its own. Unfortunately, there is no escaping this underside of growth. So it is not surprising that there are many feelings peculiar to human beings that prevent us from shedding. what has ceased to work, including fear, pride, nostalgia, a comfort in the familiar, and a want to please those that we love. Often we give up our right to renewal to accommodate the anxiety of those around us. And then he tells this interesting story from Melanesia. He says, this tribe from Melanesia contend that this is how we lost our immortality. In other words, not shedding because of the anxiety of those around us. The story goes like this. It seems at first human beings never died, but cast their skins like snakes and crabs and came out with youth renewed. But after a time, a woman growing old went to a stream to change her skin. According to some, she was Ultamarama, change skin of the world. Right, that's her name. She threw her old skin in the water and observed that as it floated, it caught on a stick. Then she went home where she had left her child, but the child refused to recognize her, crying that its mother was an old woman, not this young stranger. So to pacify the child, she went after her old skin and put it on. And from that time, human beings ceased to cast their skin and died. And so, Mark Nepo continues, when we cease to shed what's dead in us in order to soothe the fear of others, we remain partial. When we cease to surface our most sensitive skin simply to avoid conflict with others, we remove ourselves from all that is true. When we maintain ways we've already discarded just to placate the ignorance of those we love, we lose our access to what is eternal. So then he says, sit quietly and ask yourself, what voices are asking you to keep your old skin and not to change? Center yourself and ask, what is the cost to you for not renewing your connection with all that is eternal? So as we know, the goal, if we can call it that, of the spiritual life or the awakening into the present moment is to know that you're not your past. And, according to these teachings, especially coming from A Course in Miracles, there's a workbook lesson that actually says, I see only the past. My mind, another lesson goes, is preoccupied with past thoughts. So sitting here, we actually drag the past into the present, and we're looking out through a lens of what we already know and what we already think. And so we are literally just unconsciously re-embodying, regurgitating a past way of being in the present moment, and that actually blocks us from the living presence that is here now. And so we all do this. And when, you're wanting to wake up, you start to get aware of the fact that you're doing this, but you're still in relationship with people who aren't getting aware of the fact that they're doing this. And oftentimes what we're doing by trying to hang on to our past is to find some kind of safety and stability and normalcy and security. And so we cling to the way people are because that helps us feel safe in our world. It provides some kind of structure, something known and trustworthy that we can rest in saying that this won't change. I know who this person is. And so if you're on this path of growth and spiritual evolution, it's oftentimes going to be where you break away from that past way of being, and that's definitely going to upset the rhythm of the way that you're in relationship with others, which could cause major flare-ups within your most intimate connections. And so when we recognize that there is a cost to awakening, we have to sit down, as Jesus says in the gospel, and count the cost before you get started. In other words, what's worth more to you? Waking up to the fact that you are in a state of love and divine grace, and so is everyone else? Or will you reconcile yourself to play a role that is inauthentic and ultimately very unfulfilling, so that you can keep other people happy in their ignorance and in their fear and anxiety? And sometimes that could be the toughest choice to make. You know, another statement that comes from the gospel is, think not that I've come to bring peace on the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword, so that the people of one's own household will be their most heated enemies. Right? And, you know, there's like a group of scholars that, you know, come around, and it's called the Jesus Seminar, and they try to figure out, did Jesus say that? That's not the gentle Jesus. But if you look deeper, this idea of bringing a sword instead of peace is the first step towards peace. You got to cut away the old inauthenticities and the codependencies and the fear-based identities that we cling to one another in hopes to find that security, that belonging, that safety, that intimacy. So in the beginning of the spiritual journey, it can be quite the ordeal to cut the cords of these outmoded ways of being in relationship, things that we've carried from our past for decades and decades and decades. And so that's why we have to count the cost. And that's also why in many of the workbook lessons within A Course in Miracles, there are statements like, above all else, I want to see. Above all else, I want to see things differently. In other words, there has to be my ultimate concern that will override all of my temporary fears and trepidations of not cutting away, not stepping out into my own authenticity. So we have to actually recognize that at certain stages of this growing and evolving into who we truly are, there are going to be what seems to feel like ordeals, difficult decisions that actually have us break with our past. That's why, again, he says in A Course in Miracles, a miracle is an out-of-pattern time interval. Now, that sounds like gobbledygook if you first hear it, but what it's basically saying is it breaks the cycle, the stagnation. It takes you out of the normal patterning of your life and your repetitive way of being. It breaks that. It's an out-of-pattern time interval. It intervenes in this moment, and it breaks you away, maybe just for a moment, from your past. Because right now, even if you're listening, I mean, you're here, you're sort of an elite group just to be here in this conversation, right? It's not normal to think this way and on a mass scale, at least not at this time. But even here, you've arrived, 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning. That's an ordeal for many of us. And we have to break out of our own comfort zones just to be present physically. But for many of us that are still here physically, our past is fighting to stay alive in the present moment. And the miracle is an out-of-pattern time interval that's going to interrupt your way of past thinking and past learning that will oftentimes feel like we talked about last week, this internal tug of war between falling asleep as your animal self or waking up as your divine human self. So in this out of pattern time interval, we will have to look again at a place within ourselves that isn't coming from the past. And I would invite you to keep that window open in your mind as we move forward in this conversation, that there's something new for you this morning, something that you haven't considered yet. But in order to have that show up in your awareness, you must be willing to shed. Right? So, also we've brought up in recent services this quote from the Upanishads from ancient India, that a husband doesn't love his wife for the sake of his wife. He loves her because of the divine self. The wife doesn't love the husband on account of the husband, but for the sake of the divine self. So whatever you love, whatever is attractive and appealing to you in form, what's really there scintillating behind the form or through the form is the energy, the love, the attractiveness of the divine self. The form is a casing. It's the husk. I mean, when you think about how much you love a certain person or your pet, and they die, and you have the body right there, but they're gone. What's missing there? The form is there. You didn't love the form. There was something intangible that was really what you connected with. And that is the aspect of the God self in them. So when we start to recognize that we are not in love with form, we're in love with essence, we're in love with God's soul that is shining through form, we can begin to reprioritize and refine and purify the way that we love. And so Rumi has a lot to say in this matter. In this little prose, he says, the heart's the only real house of safety. And speaking of God in the masculine, he says, rejoice in him and nothing else but him. He is spring. And all other things are winter. Everything other than him drags you slowly to damnation, even if it's your throne and kingdom and crown, what you consider the ultimate success. That still is not going to satisfy you. In fact, it's going to be a major obstacle to your peace and happiness. Rejoice in grief. Grief's the way to melt into him. Ascension on this path travels from heights to depths. Grief's a final treasure, and suffering a mine. But how could mere children understand this? When children hear the word game, they start to run with a carefree noise and speed of wild donkeys. Rumi says, blind donkeys. Go that way, you'll find only traps. Run that way, you'll find massacres waiting. Arrows fly, but the bow is hidden. From the hidden world, 100 arrows of white hair fly to kill your youth. Set out now while you're strong on the heart's vast plain. You'll never discover joy on the plane of the body. The heart's the only house of safety, my friends. It has fountains and rose gardens within rose gardens. Turn to the heart and go forward, travelers of the night. There's where you'll find trees and streams of living water. So he's making also the distinction between children and the mature. Children are caught within the appearance of the body and thinking again that the form is going to satisfy them. And it never does. But children are, he's also liking them to wild donkeys, where they're led by appetite, by their animal impulses. And left unchecked, you won't find the way that leads to the heart if you're only following what your animal appetites, your impulses towards the body are doing, because that will cloud your vision. Your above all else is bodily pleasure. So if your above all else is bodily pleasure, then you've literally cut yourself off from your soul. Right? And that can be an ordeal for a long time, where we have this tug of war. Now, is it worth it? I'm going to give up what I really find to be pleasurable. Is that worth it? And that's something that you have to do your own inner calculus on. Nobody can help you on that. But again, if you sit down and assess with a calm and clear mind, you've had bodily pleasure for a long time, because I think all of us here have been hit by those invisible arrows of white hair already. I mean, they just got me in my beard. But I did get some arrows of white hair. And because we are white-haired ones, we have enough of a wisdom to know that bodily appetites, even if they're not waning naturally, are not really fully satisfying, because they come and they go, they bloom and they fade, and they never actually give you what you were hoping to find in them. Right? So Rumi says, set out for the heart and you'll find that what you really were seeking for in the body can only be found in the divine. And then this is a beautiful little story Rumi tells. It's called Never Turn Away From Me. God talked to Moses in the silence of the heart and whispered, "Oh, my chosen one, I love you." Moses answered, "Oh, generous one, tell me which part of my character makes you love me, so I can struggle to feed and embellish it." God said, "You're like a child in its mother's presence. Even if she pushes him away, he clings to her. For him, there's no one else in the world. All his agony and joy comes only from his mother. If she slaps him, he still rushes and clings to her. He doesn't look for help to anyone but his mother. She is for him all evil and all good. Your heart also, whether things are good or bad, never turns away from me. In your eyes, all other beings are just stones and clumps of earth." And so when we are looking into the idea of shedding, because the shedding is what's going to make our heart more tender, right? As we flake off the dead skin, as we give up what's been blocking us from truly feeling alive in the present moment, we're going to become increasingly more sensitive. And at first, when we shed, we're going to become more sensitive to the need, the thirst, the desire for union, right? This is what's going to actually increase. You're going to feel the longing more. And instead of directing the longing towards bodies as we've been normally accustomed to do, we will learn how to redirect that longing towards the spirit, right? And this is what really gets us out of all idolatry. Okay? Because idolatry is putting other gods before God. So if we're finding that we are in love with forms, these are idols. They are not actually the real, the true, the soul. we are worshiping them. We are devoted to these clumps of stone and clay. But they're really just ways of us looking away from the true source where all happiness, all thirst, all hunger is finally filled. Right? So what we want to then look at is where these idols are coming from and why they're in our experience in the first place. And Rumi actually says that the ego is the mother of all idols. So as long as we think of ourselves as this separate I, we will have the thirst, the hunger, the desire for God. But put through the lens of the ego says, look away from God. We don't want you to go to God because that would be the end of me as the separate little self. So we take you out into the world and we have you focus on forms and bodies and things and accolades and wealth, etc. Everything that the ego loves. So when we get to this place of shedding, we'll become more and more sensitive to this mother of all idols within the heart. This false self that's always sending us out looking for the satisfaction but never finding it. So we'll end with this last story from Rumi. Since you are I, you who are myself. Once a man came and knocked at the door of his friend. Who are you? Asked his friend. It is I, he replied. The friend said, go away. This isn't the time to enter. There's no place at a table like mine for the one who has not been cooked in the fire of true gnosis, right? True knowledge. Apart from the fire of absence and separation, what'll cook the raw or free the uncooked from fraud? The poor man went away, and for a whole year of travel and absence, he was burnt utterly by the flames of separation. His heart burned until it was consumed. He came again to the door of his friend and knocked at the door. With 100 signs of the utmost fear and reverence, terrified a wrong word should escape his lips. From within, his friend called out, "Who's at the door?" He replied, "It is you who are at the door, O charmer of hearts." "Since you are I," the friend said, "O you who are myself, enter. There's no place in my house for two eyes." So this is the Sufi teaching that basically says only God can say I. If we're saying I from a separate state, this is the false self. It's the home of the idolater. And so this false I gets cooked. It gets cooked by turning within and realizing that you're in a desert and you'll never find in the mirages of form what you truly need. This pain of separation that you feel can never be found satisfied in form. It's only when your false I gets annihilated that all the idols disappear from your heart and you're in union, right? And that union opens your eyes to a completely different reality or a different world. So take a moment. So, I joke sometimes to to basically say, okay, now who wants to annihilate themselves? Let's do it. And it's this idea like, who would ever want to annihilate yourself, the self that you know? Right? There's like so much riding on you staying who you are, that to think that you can be another self seems preposterous. And yet it's not asking you to be another self. It's actually asking you to be the self that you eternally are. So the idea of coming to a place where you are willing to, above all else, wake up to who you are, will then have you want to adjust your relationship dynamics so that things become more and more harmonious, and you begin to feel that you are in this reflection with your deepest desires in your partnerships. How can you feel like you're in a love relationship where you're not really honoring or being honored in who you truly are? Right? It's a make-believe, it's a fantasy, it's an illusion. So one of the things that we have to get clear for ourselves is we are actually the only ones who are holding us back. That's why when we listen to that story of Mark Nepo about the Melanesian woman that because of the crying child went back to the river and got her old skin back, you think like, oh, that child, right? The child is selfish. The child should have been a little more agreeable to the change. Poor woman, right? She had to go and do what she didn't want to do. But what we're in our next stage of the journey here this morning going to say is that that's actually what the woman wanted to do secretly. She didn't want to let go of her past and actually used the child's anxiety to justify the fact that she wanted her old skin back. She wasn't a victim. She was literally the architect. So one of the things that you want to recognize on this spiritual journey is you are always driving. And you're driving by your decisions. You're always at cause, and you're never a victim. Things are happening from you rather than to you. And once you begin to get that, oftentimes, Jesus says you want to wave your secret magic wand and go back to sleep. Because that's just sometimes too much responsibility to bear. Because if I'm the one that's always at the level of cause, and I then sit down and kind of, shed some of these dead ideas, it's actually going to be very confronting to look at my life and see what I've done to myself through my decision making. And so oftentimes, just because of that anxiety, that reluctance or resistance, we actually don't want to recognize that we're causing it. So we go to sleep. Instead of on the path of awakening, we're on the path of going to sleep. And what really is expertly done by the ego once we're asleep at the wheel is that the world appears to do everything to us. So everyone else in our life has to change because I'm good. If it wasn't for you, I would actually be happy. Why aren't you doing what you should be doing to make me happy? And so when we have this approach to life where we are trying to fix the screen on the movie theater, not realizing that we're projecting our movie, we'll never find the happiness, right? And so this is something that we want to look at a little more deeply in these teachings in the Course. Where in this miracle principle, he says human beings should thank God for what they really are. The children of God are very, very holy. The miracle honors their holiness. And then he says this: God's creations cannot lose their holiness, though it can be hidden. The miracle uncovers it and brings it into the light where it belongs. Holiness can never be really hidden in darkness, But a person can deceive himself on this point. Right? Your holiness is your soul, your true self. But we can deceive ourselves, ignore our soul, and be the ego. He says this illusion of being another self is what's making us fearful. Now, here's the point I really want to stress. Because in our hearts, we know it is an illusion. That's really important to get. In our hearts, sitting here right now, listening, we know it's an illusion. How many times do we come here to these services and classes and have been on the spiritual path, some of us for decades, and somehow we still don't get it, or somehow we're still not seeing the results that we want? No, we're actually seeing the results that we want. We're just not being completely straight and honest with ourselves. Deep down, we know this already. And yet, for some reason, we are choosing the illusion instead of the truth when it comes to certain relationships, for example. We're unwilling to shed what needs to be shedded in that relationship. Right? And the anxiety might look as if it's coming from, like that story, the child. But it's not the child's anxiety. It's our own. Remember, secretly, the woman actually wanted her old skin back and used the child to say, I can't live free. I can't live in this rebirth state. I have to, for the sake of the child, suffer through my old life because the child needs me to. And that is actually what he was just saying. Deep down in our heart, we know that's an illusion. That's untrue. Right? So the anxiety is our own. And what if we got present to the fact that we can actually live in a place where it's no longer what they are saying or doing that is causing us to feel what we're feeling, but it's actually that we're using them to feel what we're feeling. What we're feeling comes first. The relationship is an outward picture of an inner condition. So if we feel unworthy, we will have a relationship that will make us feel unworthy. But it's not the person and what they're doing or not doing that's causing me to feel unworthy. I already feel unworthy. And so I'm using this relationship to reinforce it. That's why he says the miracle sets validity. Sorry, this is really key. So we know that we're doing this to ourselves deep down in our heart, and we go to sleep as often as we can, right? And right now, it might be like a little woodpecker on your heart, and you're like, ugh. You could feel it. I'm sure you can. And the fear, the upset, the annoyance, whatever it is that's coming up, don't mistake that. The boredom, whatever it is that's coming up, that is trying to ditch out of really getting the message. And it's coming up in your own voice. It's giving you the impulse to not pay attention or to muffle or mask what you're hearing in such a way that you can escape it and go back to sleep. And he says, as with all illusions, right, we're doing all of this to ourselves. We know we're doing it to ourselves. We are the master of all illusions. Our ego is the mother of all idols. And so with all illusions, he goes on to say, we exert enormous efforts to establish the validity of our illusions. we exert enormous effort to make our world look the way it does, where we're not at fault. We're not causing this. Right? The miracle acknowledges only the truth. It thus dispels a person's illusions about himself and puts him into communion with himself and with God. You know, it came up in class on Monday last week when Lisa and I were up here for the course class, that the personality construct that we are living as right now, we call it our name, our story, our history, our biography. This personality construct is actually a way of trying to avoid the pain of separation and disconnect that we feel at our core. And so the personality construct comes in as a way of keeping us safe and then having us hope that we can find the remedy to our pain in others and in the world. And so we've exerted enormous effort in building this personality construct. And we identify with it. We have a whole world that tells us that's who we are. All of our relationships tell us that we are this construct. And what we're doing here on a Sunday morning and on a Monday night is denying that's the real you. And he says in this teaching, everyone identifies with their thought system. And if you go against what somebody believes in their thought system, it feels like an attack. It feels like you're invalidating who they are. And so if you come here as your ego, you will feel invalidated. And it will oftentimes run where if you don't have this above all else, I want to wake up, going on when you're sitting here, the ego will go, go to sleep, distract. Prove that he's wrong in your own thinking. Sit there and smile at him and shake your head, yes, if you have to. But he's not going to invalidate us because we know who we are. We know what we want. If you're not giving yourself an inkling of deeper self-reflection than your own identity construct, you'll come and go without any change, any rebirth. It'll be the same dead old you that comes through the door, sits here, and goes home. But the intention here is to shed, to let go, to be free of the shackles of your past. And when you really step out into the present moment, free from your past, knowing that you're generating, moment by moment, what your world will show up as, you will be so glad you're freed from your own idol. And you won't want to go back. Right? So this is where it comes back to how we show up in our relationships. So we all deep down know that we're running a con, right? We are scamming ourselves. We're deceiving ourselves. You know, I remember hearing many, many years ago when Carolyn Mace was running her, doing her book tour. She gave a talk, and she had said, I'm always stressing to my audience that it's not that you are not intuitive. It's that you are so intuitive that you're actually using your power not to be intuitive. And that's exactly what we're talking about here this morning. You know you're doing this to yourself in your heart. But are you allowing that voice, that information, to come up clear enough for you to do something about it. And don't use your relationships as a way of scapegoating the responsibility, thinking, if only this person that I'm with were different, I would feel love for myself in my life. No. No, you wouldn't. You would actually just find somebody else to replace them in their role to prove to you that you're right about who you are. So that's why he says, in regards to relationships with your brothers and sisters, since thoughts do not have to be conscious to exist, whoever this person is, he calls them your brother. Your brother does not have to be aware of the higher self, either in himself or in you, for this miracle to occur. Your brother may have dissociated the call for God just as you have, but the dissociation is healed in both of you as you see the call in her and thus acknowledge its being. Right? So this is where you start to see, what's my above all else? What's my ultimate concern? Is it my pleasure? Is it my satisfaction? Is it having people show up to do what I think is the right thing to do? Or do I really want to awaken to the higher self in myself? Because what you'll look for in the other person is what you really want to see in yourself. So if he says that it doesn't matter if that other person is completely not into spiritual teaching or wanting to wake up or blah, 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 could be hostile to it. Doesn't matter. But deep down, they are who they are. And there is the call of God in them, even though they have dissociated it. They're not even aware of it. But if you're above all else is to hear the call for yourself, then they're in relationship with you, and you're literally going to pull that into the relationship through them. You're going to look for that in them. You're going to magnetize that frequency, that call, for the two of you to experience it. Now, they may run for the hills, and you may never see them again. But there's your shedding. It happens automatically. As soon as you get dialed in to your true self, your real relationships will come in. Or the ones that are there that have the potential to be real will get stronger and brighter. Those that you're using to hide out in your illusions and you're using them as idols, they're going to shed. They'll have to, because you're dialed in. They're only there because you're refusing not to be dialed in, and so you want them there to prove you're not doing this to yourself. If you say of a brother that, let's say it this way, it means that there are two ways of seeing your brother, and also that they are diametrically opposed to one another. These two ways must be in your mind, because you are the perceiver. They must also be in her mind, because you are perceiving her. What you are really saying then is that you will not look at her through your ego or perceive her ego in her. That's what you're saying. I'm done feeding the ego in myself and in this relationship. Stated positively, you will see her through the Holy Spirit in your mind and perceive the Holy Spirit in her. And this finally here. What you acknowledge in your brother, you are acknowledging in yourself what you share, you strengthen, whatever that is. The voice of the Holy Spirit is weak in you. That is why you must share it, because it must be increased in strength before you can hear it. It is impossible to hear it in yourself while it is so weak in your own mind. Finally, listen to this. The voice of the Holy Spirit is not weak in itself, but it is limited by your unwillingness to hear it. I have just one more thing to share with you. So remember, what we talk about on a Sunday morning is not religion. It's even kind of an injustice to call it spirituality in its normal sense. It's a deep psychology. It's a way of knowing yourself immediately, directly, and integrally. That means all levels of awakening, your holistic self. And it's always geared towards your direct experience in the immediate moment. It's not filling you with folklore and mythology and storytelling and making you feel all special and, cuddly and fuzzy inside as a limit itself. It's basically saying you are the one self, and until you know that, you're not going to be happy. Until you know that, your relationships aren't going to work. Until you know that, your world will look the way it does. So this teaching is no BS. And as Lisa likes to say, there ain't no wiggle room. Right? It's either you're sleeping in this moment or you're choosing to wake up. And you'll know that by how you feel. So when it comes to your relationships, we have these special people in our life that are fuzzy, comfy, or maybe chaotic and crazy. But in whatever way that they show up, we use them to stay asleep. We use them to be our past. We use them to hide from ourselves the fact that we're causing it. And we do this under the guise of another self, which the Course calls the ego. And listen to what it says. The ego is the self-appointed mediator of all relationships, making whatever adjustments it deems necessary and interposing them between those who would meet to keep them separate and to prevent their union. It is this studied interference which makes it difficult to recognize your holy relationship for what it is. So the ego is always getting in between you and your relationship partners. And you're seeing through the lens of your past, and you're seeing from your ego, and you're looking at their ego. And as a result of that, there's no union. There's a studied interference. Like, we are never going to really connect. We might say the words, but the feeling, the experience ain't there. But this is getting to the root of it again, where he says, you make the world and then adjust to it and it to you. Nor is there any difference between yourself and your world in your own perception, because you made them both. You made yourself and you made a world to adjust to the self you determined to be. Your world can't look different until you realize you authored it. Your relationships are looking that way because of the you think you are. And he says this now in italics. He says, you made all of this up. It is a picture of what you think you are, of how you see yourself. And it makes you very sad deep down, right? Because you don't have the union. You don't have the joy. You don't have the ecstatic bliss of being in love's presence. You're outside of love's presence as the little self. So it makes us very sad, and he says something so beautiful. He says, all these are but fearful thoughts of those who would adjust themselves to a world made fearful by their adjustments. And they look out in sorrow from what is sad within and see sadness in the world. So remember, this is all a redirection to where the sadness really is. And instead of running or hiding or ignoring it, we want to address it. He says, have you ever wondered what the world is really like? How it would look through happy eyes? I happen to live with a Disney princess, so I get it through osmosis. But I'm headed there. She's a definite sign on the road that I'm going in the right direction. The world you see is but a judgment on yourself. It is not there at all. But judgment lays a sentence on it, justifies it, and makes it seem real. Such is the world you see, a judgment on yourself and made by you. This sickly picture of yourself is carefully preserved by the ego, whose image it is and which it loves, and placed outside you in the world. And to this world you adjust, as long as you believe this picture is outside and has you at its mercy. How good is it to know that's not true? You're not at the mercy of the world. You're not at the mercy of the people in your life that aren't doing what you think they should, or saying horrible things, or being horrible, or unloving. You made that up. They're there by your invitation. Don't go to sleep to that. Address it. I wanted to end on a good note, happy note. And I thought I did have something happy to say to you. All right, here's a good note. The blue bag's going to go around. You get to give. It's in giving that we receive. If you're showing up on Facebook or YouTube, you can click the link below in the comments section and donate to the 8 a.m. service, to which we are greatly appreciative of your support. Any thoughts from you guys, gals? Thank you. We bless the offering. We charge it with the intention that all beings are by nature happy and free. May this come about in this energy form, in whatever form it may take, that they are reminded of this truth. And so it is. So that's what we were saying. Everything is a holistic self, right? So the money, your car, your house, your clothes, everything is part of you in that regard. And so it's a constant way of staying in touch with this deeper narrative. I'll leave you with this final idea. In Sufism, they say that God's signs or God's messages can come to you through the world or the cosmos. They can come to you through your heart, and they can come to you through sacred scriptures or sacred teachings. And what starts to show up as we shed these dead ideas and we become increasingly more sensitive, we are getting plugged into this divine narrative that is actually speaking to us every moment through everything. If you walk into Publix later or whatever that may look like, and you hear a song as soon as you walk in, you can sometimes feel this is God's little wink at me. You drive by, you see a billboard. It might remind you to relax or do something like that. And that is actually a way of seeing God is winking at me. I am being taught and guided and loved and held every moment through everything if I'm paying attention. And actually, I do have a minute, and that was the final teaching that I had planned for us. I hope I can find it. Oh. It was so beautiful, and I'll probably find it when I go home and wish that it was. Oh, here it is. So it is God's beauty that eyes that see can look upon, right? When we wake up, our eyes are open, and it's his beauty that we can look upon. It is his loveliness that we will see in everything. And it is he that we look for everywhere and find no sight or place or time where he is not. Okay? Above all else, let's do this. Let's rise and seal the deal. As we settle within the heart, we can feel those gentle arms of divine presence holding and supporting us. And we relax and soften into this divine embrace. And as we are held within heaven's arms, we know that the light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. And the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is. Amen. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Thank you so much. Course in Miracles tomorrow night, 7:15 p.m. Make it if you can.